I once heard somebody say that basically all religions are basically the same. And I sat there and I thought about that for a moment, and I went, well, yeah, except for God and Jesus and what's wrong and how to fix it and the outcome. Other than those details, they're pretty much the same. But one of my emphasis in ministry and in theology is, of course, the resurrection. Basically, if anybody ever asks me, what's the difference between Christianity and this religion, that religion, the other religion, all those religions and stuff like that, well, basically, we have a risen Savior. We have a founder who died and came back. I don't know of any other religion that has that. So that's where I see the biggest difference, and that's also where I see the best way to explain the differences. And again, for the last couple of weeks I've been focused on the resurrection because, again, I think it is the pivotal, I think it's the breaker, I think it's what sets Christianity apart from any other worldview or religion. Now, some people have claimed that the resurrection is just an invented story. People back then didn't understand death, and so they have other explanations of the resurrection other than he died and he rose again. Well, that is what we call historical snobbery, where after the Enlightenment in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we became so smart, and everybody before that was so stupid that they couldn't even understand death. Now that's just wrong, and you can go back to Plato 100 years, 200 years before Christ and see that they understood death in the ancient world. People died, and they had a great tendency to stay dead. By the way, that still applies today. But what Dr. Whittaker came up with, and what I'm about to talk about this morning, is E.A.S.T.E.R. And the E is empty tomb, the A is appearances, the S is skeptics converted, the T is transformed apostles, the E is earliness, and that's going to be key, and finally the R is right, R-I-T-E, right. Did you know that today we could totally go jump on an airplane and go over to Jerusalem? I'm going to need you to spot me the price of a ticket, plus we're going to have to get me a passport because mine's expired. But we could go over to Jerusalem and we could go visit the Jesus tombs, plural, tombs. This one is one of the more famous ones, but it has recently fallen out of favor because this one is much too late to even be a contender anymore. This one, if you look at this picture of it and you squint your eyes and turn your head, you can kind of see a skull, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they say, of course, Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, which is the place of the skull. So they suggest that this is the crucifixion site, and maybe one of these caves could be the burial site of Jesus. This one is very popular because it actually dates to the 1st century. It's a garden tomb that has a good chance of being the one. You can see how the stone could roll this way, that way. And then, of course, you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is recognized by Roman Catholicism and many of the Orthodox branches, Syriac and Greek and so forth. Now, this part of the building dates to about the 4th century. The rest of what you can see here is much, much newer than the 4th century. But here is the original, probably restored and touched up over the years. But this dates back to about the 4th century. The bottom line is we don't know which tomb of Jesus's was Jesus's tomb, and that's primarily because the early church actually didn't care too much about the empty tomb because he wasn't in the tomb. If he's not in the tomb, then the tomb doesn't really matter that much, does it? It's not until about the 4th century that we start to see pilgrimages to Jerusalem to see the tomb of Jesus. Now, this is me stepping away from history and me stepping into what I just imagine and so forth. So here come a bunch of Christians, and here are the people who live in Jerusalem, and the Christians say, we want to see Jesus' tomb. And they go, we could make some money on this. It's that one. It's that one. You know? Okay, there we go. And then some other people saw that and go, hey, we could make some money on that. It's not that one, it's that one. And that's how we got so many Jesus tombs. That's my theory. The enemies of Christianity in the 1st and into the 2nd century, the Jews and the Romans, they never ever attempted to put Jesus back in the tomb. And what I mean by that is any works we have by the Romans or any works we have by the Jews to explain it, never try to say he's still in the tomb. We know where he is. We've seen the body, things like that. Remember in Matthew 28:13, Matthew tells us that the Jews have been spreading this rumor that the disciples came and stole the body away. You remember this? Well, there's a little bit of an implicit message there that the tomb is empty. If the Jews have to spread a message that the disciples stole the body, then they're conceding that the tomb is empty. Now, if Matthew is going to invent a story, is he going to invent a story like this? Is he going to really give you, the reader of his gospel, reason to doubt his account? Or is he just going to give you what the Jews are saying during that time? Well, about a century or a century and a half later, Tertullian is still reporting that that's the common explanation amongst the Jews, that the disciples came at night and stole Jesus' body. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. Is that even a plausible theory? But
so Tertullian is an early historian?
Tertullian is our earliest church historian. He wrote a lot of good stuff. He's considered an early church father. Joseph of Arimathea, we all remember him from these episodes in the resurrection story, right? Mark identifies him as a member of the Sanhedrin. Does anybody know what Jewish body condemned Jesus? The Sanhedrin condemned Jesus. Now, if we're just going to invent a story, should we invent a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, or should we just say it was Bob, who lived between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and we lost his number years ago, so don't ask us where he is today? I mean, is that really how you make up a story? You invent a political leader, you invent a senator who never existed, you invent a mayor who never existed? That's not very good story making, is it? Both the Jews and the Romans knew where the tomb was. Remember, the Jews go to Pilate and say, put a guard on the tomb so that his disciples don't come and steal the body. So Rome and the Jews know which one the tomb is, and they put a guard on it. And they both could have at least dissuaded the growth of Christianity by producing a body. Now, people who say that after so long the body wouldn't be recognizable, you're right, there would be decomp, but the height, the wounds, the hair, a lot about the body would still be identifiable, and many people would be able to say, oh, they have a dead Messiah, I'm not joining, I'm going with that group, you know? But neither the Romans nor the Jews ever attempt to put Jesus back into the tomb, which implies an empty tomb. The appearances. This is a very famous artwork by an Italian artist in the 16th or 17th century. Does anybody notice that the artist is taking some liberties with this? In John, we get the story where Jesus appears to the 12, minus Judas, and minus Thomas. And Thomas says to the guys, it's a great story, but I'm not going to believe you. I'm not going to believe you unless he shows up and I get to put my fingers in his wounds and my hand in his side, right? And so the next week, Jesus comes and says, here's my hands, here's my side. Look at me, stop being unbelieving and believe. The text never tells us that Thomas ever actually touched Jesus. The text tells us that Thomas goes, my Lord and my God. So, artist license there. The appearances are very, very early in Christianity. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, Paul's writing along. He's writing his letter to the Corinthians. He's got a lot to correct. In English, we have something called a run-on sentence. A run-on sentence is something that just keeps going and going and going and going and going and going and going. And that's a good example of a run-on sentence. Paul didn't write in English. Paul wrote in Koine Greek. And in Koine Greek, there's a little bit more lenience with run-on sentences. And Paul loves run-on sentences. He just loves them. And yet we get to this section and suddenly his writing style changes dramatically. And he keeps using a specific word. That specific word is translated into English, and then, or after that, or da-da-da-da-da. And that keeps showing up here in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. And this is what we think is an early creed in the church. First, I passed on to you what I received of first importance. Jesus died according to the Scriptures, was buried, and on the third day he rose again according to the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and more than 500 at one time, and to James, and then also to Paul. The way it's structured, it has a very nice meter to it that makes it very reminderable, whatever word I'm trying to say there. This is very, very early. The crucifixion happened in either 30 or 33 AD. Some people have planted their flag on 30. People have planted their flag on 33. I don't know, because Passover lands on Friday in both 30 and 33 AD. They both fit very well, so I don't know which one it is. Paul's conversion happens in either somewhere between 31 and 34. It happens very quickly after the resurrection. Paul meets with the other apostles 3 years later, Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. I went up to Jerusalem and I met with them and so forth. And we believe that that's when he received this creed from them. Meaning that the creed was already in existence and the church was already using that creed before this meeting. Meaning that this creed could have been well established and used in the church within 5 years of the cross. That is incredibly important because with the rise of biblical criticism, starting in about the early 1800s, theories started to pop up that the Gospels are embellishments 100 years later. Nobody believed in a resurrection until about 100 years later and stuff like that. We have very good evidence that the church was using this creed, which specifies Jesus died according to the Scriptures, that he was buried. Do you bury somebody who doesn't exist? No, you bury somebody who exists. Do you bury somebody who's alive? No, you bury somebody who's dead. So the bodily and literal death of Jesus is implied in the creed. And then he rises 3 days later according to the Scriptures. The whole Jesus movement is based on an interpretation of the Old Testament being fulfilled in this person of Jesus Christ, and that he appeared to his followers. Gospel appearances. Now, when you take the last 2 chapters of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and you read them, one of the things that's going to stand out to you is there could have been no collusion at this point. And we don't even need Mueller to tell us that there's no collusion on this point. If you look at it, nobody has the exact same details, and several have one appearance that nobody else mentions. Now, Mary Magdalene gets the honor of being our first. She's mentioned in the long ending of Mark. She's mentioned in John. And this is very important. She's a woman. A woman is the first eyewitness to the resurrection. Now, today that wouldn't be as much of a problem, but in first century Palestine, the Levant, and especially in Jewish society, women couldn't testify in court. Women weren't considered reliable witnesses. And so to have a woman as the first witness to the resurrection is just bad storytelling if you're going to invent a story, right? This is why some of the later Gospels, such as the Gospel of Peter, tells about the high priest spending the night in the cemetery. Did you hear that? The high priest of Judaism spending the night in the cemetery. Is that ever going to happen? The eve of Passover, the most holy day of the year, is coming up. He needs to be ritualistically clean. And this author of a gospel from 200, 300 years later tells us that he spent the night in the cemetery watching the tomb. Right? No, nothing like that. John, though, decides to invent that a woman was the first witness. John, that's just bad storytelling. Make Peter the first witness. That would help our case. Make the apostles the first witness. That will really help. Don't have it a woman. And then Matthew tells us that there's possibly other women who are our first witnesses to the resurrection. This is bad story inventing if it's story inventing. You want to know why I think it's in there? Because that's how it happened, and they're not inventing a story. The road to Emmaus disciples who don't even recognize it's Jesus until they get to the destination and the breaking of the bread. Simon Peter has a very interesting appearance. We're told it very quickly in Luke, and it's mentioned in our 1 Corinthians 15 creed, but there's no details given. That's a little bit odd because Peter's going to be the first spokesman for the church, and we really need a good resurrection appearance for him, right? And yet, the church isn't interested in telling about this. They just mention that it happens. The group, which would be the 11, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, John chapter 20, and then the week later, Thomas is there. The group fishing trip where everybody went fishing up in Galilee again and Jesus shows up on the shore. The Galilean mountaintop, that could possibly be the 500. We're never told when the 500 happened. There you can see James. That's going to be very interesting because who is this James? Well, we of course have an apostle James, right? He's John's brother. It must be him, right? Except that it's already mentioned that he's already appeared to the apostles. So if this is just going to be the apostle James, he's already appeared to him. Why point this out? So I'm thinking this is going to be brother James. And we're going to get to brother James here in a moment. Then another appearance to the disciples, and the ascension appearance, and then Paul's appearance. They all happen in different places. They happen to different people. The accounts are incredibly different. The church did not get together and organize and share notes and say, here's how we're going to tell the story of the resurrection. The gospel writers wrote what they knew about it, and it doesn't have the earmarks of later conspiracy. Skeptics converted. So here we are at skeptics converted, the S in Easter. We have two people, James, that is brother James, and Paul, who is, of course, Saul of Tarsus. When we first meet brother James in John chapter 7, not even his brothers believe him. This is the episode where Jesus has stayed at home so far, and his brothers are saying, hey, you want to be famous, don't you? Go off to Jerusalem. Go be famous. We get the episode where Jesus' family comes to take custody of him. They all think he's out of his mind. And then at the cross, we have Jesus on the cross, and we have some women at the foot of the cross, including his mother Mary and the disciple that Jesus loved. And Jesus entrusts the care of his mother to the disciple that Jesus loved. Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. John, I'm about to die. Somebody needs to take care of my mom. I can't trust my brothers. They don't believe in me. So we know that James is not a follower of Jesus at the beginning of Jesus' ministry up into the crucifixion. And yet, after the resurrection appearances and after the start of the church, James becomes a leader and at some point is the leader of the Jerusalem church. How many of you have a brother? What would it take to convince you that that brother of yours is the Son of God? I have 2 brothers. You're not going to convince me that either one of my brothers is the Son of God. Now, if I witnessed one of my brothers publicly executed, and 3 days later he shows up looking okay and not executed, that's going to really get me scratching my head, right? Then we have Saul of Tarsus. Now, Saul of Tarsus, when we first meet him, is a Pharisee. We come to find out that Paul has Roman citizenship that his dad purchased. That means that Saul may not be the richest kid on the block, but he's a very well-to-do kid. He's one of the Pharisees. He's got a promising career ahead of him. He's been educated. He can write in beautiful Greek. And when he hears about the Jesus movement, he sees it as a heresy of Judaism. And yet, the next thing we know, this well-to-do, moving in and amongst the who's and what's of Judaism, suddenly drops all of that to switch sides and join the Jesus movement. Now, what happened there? That this guy is willing to change sides in the battle. How many of you have a political opinion? How many of you then have an opinion that's not your political opinion, and you would be against that opinion? What would it take to get you to suddenly drop your opinion and join their team? I mean, you would need a really good reason to drop your side and to join their side, right? Skeptics converted. Now this transformed apostles. Something happened between the Garden of Gethsemane and Pentecost. Remember, as we get to the garden, Peter has already said, Jesus, I'm with you. I'm with you to the end. I'm going to stick with you. I'm going to go to prison. I'm going to die with you. And when the guards show up and everything falls apart, what happens to all 12 of them? They're taking off. They're leaving. They're not hanging around. Something took frightened disciples hiding in locked rooms, took them into the streets of Jerusalem and into the Roman world, proclaiming the resurrection of Christ. Something transformed the apostles. Now I'm going to quote N.T. Wright this morning. N.T. Wright is one of my favorite authors. He's one of the foremost scholars of the New Testament, and I just love what he says here. We have some data from about 100 years before to 100 years after Jesus, of about a dozen other people who ever stood up and said, guys, I'm the Messiah, follow me, and we're going to get rid of Rome. In fact, one of them we meet in the book of Acts, when the apostles are in custody and the Jews are deliberating what to do. Gamaliel stands up and he reminds us, Theudas rose up in the days of the census and drew off men to himself. He was killed and the rest of his group disbanded. How many of you know a Mennonite today? They practice Mennonitism. Nobody seems to know this. Well, he was the king of the Jews. He proclaimed himself king of the Jews, and Rome caught him, and Rome executed him. And yet nobody today is a follower of Mennonitism, right? And yet here we have Jesus. Jesus stands up and says, I'm the guy, follow me. Rome gets him and Rome crucifies him, right? We're all in agreement at this point, right? N.T. Wright has this terrific saying, in the first century, when your favorite Messiah gets himself killed, then you basically have two choices. Either go home and stop following Messiahs, or get yourself a new Messiah. And that's exactly what we see with all these other movements that we know about. The guy got himself killed and the followers are like, hey, back away, man. Just keep quiet, keep your heads down. Maybe we'll get out of this alive, you know? Or, well, he wasn't the Messiah, but his brother is the Messiah. That's our new Messiah, you know. But you look at the early church never said, James, the brother of Jesus, he's the Messiah now. We're going to follow him as the brother. No, James was never the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. And they're proclaiming the resurrection. These scared people hiding in an inner room, wondering if they're going to get out of this alive, suddenly turn about and start preaching Jesus resurrected. Something happened that changed them. Earliness. Earliness is incredibly important to the resurrection. Pentecost is only 50 days after Passover. Passover is when he's crucified, he's buried, he resurrects. 50 days later, in Jerusalem, they're preaching Jesus resurrected. This is a little bit of what we call the Jerusalem factor. Now, today, we of course can, at the press of a button, send information all over the world. People on the other side of the globe can get our data right away, right? Not so in the ancient world. So now, if none of it's real and we're just going to invent the story, okay? Are we going to invent the story and stay in Jerusalem when we invent the story? The place he was publicly executed. Or wouldn't it be a better idea to get out of Dodge? We'll go to Athens. We'll go to Rome. We'll go somewhere else, and then we'll start proclaiming the resurrection. Because it's going to take time then for people to travel, take time for people to check our facts, right? And yet here we are 50 days later in Jerusalem preaching the resurrection. Paul's conversion happens within 1 to 3 years of the cross, and he begins preaching Jesus' resurrection. His missionary journeys happened between 47 and 58. All of Paul's letters mention the resurrection. 1 Corinthians is the most vivid. And all of these are going out between 47 and 58. It's not 100 years later, it's not 50 years later, it's within like 20 or 30 years later that Paul is preaching this stuff. And we've already seen that they were preaching this before Paul joined the team, right? How many people here are more than 50 days old? How many people here are more than 20 years old? 30 years old? I'll be 30 next year, but we right here have people that are older than 30. And you can remember an event that happened more than 30 years ago, right? Hopefully. Depends. Have I had my coffee yet, right? Can't remember what happened yesterday. Did I advance there or didn't I? I think I had a double slide. James, this is brother James, is martyred in 62. So that means that his Jesus-centered writing is written before 62. And that Jesus-centered writing is distributed to the Jews. And James is telling the Jews that yes, my brother was the Messiah within about 33 years of the crucifixion. It's very early, and remember we already talked about that early creed. Here, I actually have a very unlikely ally. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is, I don't know how to pronounce his last name actually, Ehrman or Ehrman. He is the professor of religious studies at Chapel Hill. Last year he wrote the book, The Triumph of Christianity. And although I disagree with him on almost every single point he could ever state, just on principle, he does say that the Christians believed in the resurrection before the conversion of Paul. He's trying to explain the rise of Christianity in the early church. And he's a skeptic. And he has to confess that in that early century, the Jesus followers already believed in a literal resurrection. Now, it would be one thing to cite one of my favorite authors. I've already talked about N.T. Wright. And it would be one thing to cite another author who's very popular amongst evangelical Christianity, right? Here's a guy who's not popular amongst evangelical Christianity. Here's a guy who's not a conservative. He's a liberal. He's a critic. And yet he has to admit that before Paul joins the team already believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is so early in the history of the church. finally rite, R-I-T-E, as in a religious rite, something happened to this first century Second Temple group of Jews to abandon their cultural identities and norms and suddenly start accepting Samaritans and Gentiles. This doesn't seem to be that well understood in our society. But you've got to remember that these first century Second Temple Jews were always brought up with we're the chosen people. We're the people of God. The Samaritans are kind of half Jews. They're out. And the Gentiles are even outer, out. And we have certain cultural identities, circumcision, dietary laws, many other things that are their identity. Not just something they like, not just the TV show they watch on Saturday night. Their identity is in these things, and yet they're willing to abandon those things and open the doors to the Samaritans and open the doors to the Gentiles. How many of you have a worldview? You think this is the way the world works, and it would work even better if everybody agreed with me on this topic and on that topic and on this topic, right? So we can relate to these guys. We can, because we have our norms, both our cultural norms and our religious norms, right? I mean, who here wants a king? We actually fought a war so that we don't have a king. Americans don't like the idea of kings, right? What would suddenly happen that would make us all want a king? Other than Jesus, have to say that. Who here wants a king? Because I'll throw my name in just in case we're going to vote on it. Anyway. But to get people to suddenly change everything about them, everything about their worldview, something cataclysmic, something huge has to happen. And to start including the outsiders, the people that we've been raised our whole life to view as the others, we're now saying, come on in. Something happened. Our earliest sources on New Testament baptism relate to the reality of Christ's resurrection. You remember how baptism works, right? We take a person and we dip them. And that is a symbol of Christ went into the grave, they went into the grave, right? And then what happens? We bring them back up. We don't just leave them down there, right? Right. Because they have to come back up, because they're a type of Christ's resurrection. This is all in Romans chapter 6. Paul takes baptism and the resurrection and puts them together in a way that baptism doesn't make any sense without it. Baptism without the resurrection is just a bath. Our earliest sources on New Testament communion once again relate Jesus' death and resurrection to it. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, but all of our other texts also have this in there. What are we doing? We're taking the bread that represents His body. We're taking the cup which represents His blood, and we're proclaiming His death until He comes again. He comes again because He was resurrected. All of our rites and the very existence of the church are reliant on the reality of the resurrection.